Good evening. Tonight, the world watches in shock as Tel Aviv faces the unimaginable, a total assault from Hamas that has already shifted the fragile balance of the Middle East. The headlines tonight are brutal, the images heartbreaking, and the consequences unpredictable. Gaza is under fire, proxies across the region are moving into place, and Israel finds itself at the edge of an existential crisis. This isn't just another escalation. This is a moment that could redraw the map of power politics and survival in the Middle East. The attack on Tel Aviv by Hamas has been described as unprecedented, not merely because of its scale, but because of the message it sends to Israel, to the region, and to the rest of the world. This is not the same kind of attack we have seen before in the long history of conflict between Hamas and Israel. What unfolded was coordinated, targeted, and designed to achieve maximum shock value. It is one thing for Hamas to launch sporadic rocket fire, something Israel has lived with for years. It is another thing entirely to orchestrate what appears to be a total assault on the country's economic and cultural heart. Tel Aviv is not just another city in Israel. It is the beating heart of Israel's modern identity, its global face, its symbol of innovation, progress, and resilience. When Tel Aviv is attacked in such a sweeping and brazen way, it is more than a military maneuver. It is a political statement, a psychological strike, and a test of Israel's deterrence. Ask yourself this: what does Hamas gain from going this far? What calculation drives such a bold move? Knowing Israel's history of answering violence with overwhelming force, the answer lies in the shock factor. Hamas is not trying to win a conventional war against Israel. It knows it cannot do that. What Hamas is trying to do is change the conversation, reset the balance, and prove that it can strike at the very core of Israel's security and pride. The attack on Tel Aviv is not simply about rockets in the sky. It is about demonstrating reach, capability, and audacity. It is about proving to both supporters and enemies alike that Hamas is not just a nuisance at Israel's border, but a real force capable of shaking the foundations of Israeli society. And here is where the stakes rise. Tel Aviv is not just Israel's city, it is the world's window into Israel. Every image of chaos, every video of people rushing to shelters, every sound of air raid sirens piercing through the city becomes global news instantly. Hamas knows this. They are not only fighting on the ground, they are fighting on screens, in headlines, on social media feeds. Every successful strike on Tel Aviv amplifies their presence, their relevance, and their ability to dictate the terms of the narrative. This is the new battlefield, where perception is as important as firepower. The sheer boldness of this assault sends a chilling question across the region. If Hamas can hit Tel Aviv this hard, what can Hezbollah do from the north? What role might Iran play behind the scenes? These are not theoretical concerns. They are the real ripple effects of an attack that was calculated to break Israel's sense of invulnerability. For decades, Israel has relied on its military supremacy and its advanced defense systems like the Iron Dome to shield its cities and reassure its citizens. But when Hamas demonstrates the ability to overwhelm those defenses, even for a short period of time, it punctures the image of security that Israel projects to its people and to the world. And when that image is punctured, fear spreads. Fear is a weapon, and Hamas knows how to use it. The hook of this story, the part that draws every headline and every urgent discussion tonight, is the sheer audacity of Hamas choosing Tel Aviv as its target for what looks like a total strike. It forces Israel to respond, not just militarily, but symbolically. No Israeli leader can afford to let an attack of this magnitude go unanswered. The political pressure, the demand for retaliation, the need to restore deterrence, all of it builds instantly. And that, too, is part of the design. Hamas is not just launching rockets. It is pulling Israel into a narrative of escalation that drags everyone else, Gaza's civilians, Israel's civilians, and potentially the entire region, into a spiral that no one can fully control. This is what makes tonight different. This is not another border clash, not another round of rockets and counterstrikes. This is Hamas declaring in action, if not in words, that Tel Aviv is now vulnerable. And the world has to ask, if Tel Aviv can be hit like this, what happens next? Who steps forward to stop the fire before it spreads across the region? And who will pay the price for a gamble that may reshape the entire Middle East? Israel's response to the assault on Tel Aviv has been as swift as it is relentless. That is not surprising. Israel has always operated under the doctrine that any attack on its cities, particularly its most symbolic and vital ones, must be answered with overwhelming force. The nation's military identity is built on deterrence, on projecting power so great that its enemies think twice before striking. When Hamas launched a coordinated attack on Tel Aviv, it triggered that instinct instantly. The response from Israel is not just about defending its people. It is about sending a message to Hamas, to Gaza, and to every proxy in the region that Israel will not allow itself to appear weak even for a moment. That is why we are seeing Gaza being struck with an intensity that has already left its skyline in ruins and its people desperate for survival. And here is where the story becomes more than just military strategy. Israel's retaliation is not only about military targets. Yes, Israel claims to be hitting Hamas positions, weapon stockpiles, and command centers. But the reality of Gaza is that Hamas operates among civilians in crowded neighborhoods, in schools, in hospitals, in places where people live their daily lives. That means every strike on Hamas becomes inevitably a strike on Gaza itself. And this is where the cycle of violence takes its cruelest form. For every rocket launched at Tel Aviv, dozens of bombs fall on Gaza, and with them, entire families are displaced. Lives are lost, futures are erased. This is not collateral damage. It is the grim, predictable outcome of a strategy that aims to restore deterrence through devastation. Israel's government knows that the world is watching. They know that every missile they launch into Gaza is captured on phones, shared across social media, and broadcast to millions around the world. So why do they continue with such relentless force? The hook here is simple. Israel believes that it has no choice. When the heart of Tel Aviv is targeted, when Israelis see rockets streaking toward their homes, their leaders must restore a sense of security, no matter the cost. To do nothing, or to respond too softly, would be seen domestically as weakness, and weakness is not an option in Israeli politics. This is as much about public confidence as it is about military necessity. What Hamas did by striking Tel Aviv was to put Israel's leadership in a corner. They forced a hand that was always going to be played. Now, the response is not just airstrikes. It is the language of retaliation. It is prime ministerial statements vowing to crush Hamas like never before. It is military briefings promising that Gaza will be left with nothing from which to strike again. These are not just words. They are signals designed for both internal and external audiences. To Israelis, they say, "We are strong, we will protect you, and we will not allow this to happen again." To Hamas and its backers, they say, "You may strike us, but we will strike you harder, faster, and longer." Yet, here is the truth beneath that rhetoric: retaliation does not end the cycle. It fuels it. Every bomb dropped on Gaza creates new resentment, new grief, new anger that Hamas and its proxies can channel into their cause. Every building destroyed becomes an image for propaganda, a rallying cry for resistance, a recruitment tool for the next generation of fighters. And Israel knows this. They have lived this reality for decades. But in the immediate aftermath of a direct attack on Tel Aviv, the calculation is not about the long term. It is about the present, about showing strength in a moment of crisis, about proving that Israel's enemies cannot act without consequences. The question that lingers is chilling: how much devastation will be considered enough? How many strikes on Gaza will be required before Israeli leaders believe deterrence is restored? And at what cost to Gaza's 2 million civilians who have nowhere to run, no safe place to hide, no escape from the airstrikes raining down on their neighborhoods? These are not theoretical questions. They are the lived reality of families huddled in dark apartments, of children crying as explosions light up the night sky, of hospitals overwhelmed by the endless stream of the injured. The hook that keeps pulling us back to this story is the imbalance of power. Hamas struck Tel Aviv with rockets, but Gaza is now facing a storm of retaliation that no defense system can shield against. Israel's message is clear: for every strike on Tel Aviv, Gaza will feel tenfold the weight of retribution. And as the strikes continue, the world is left asking whether this path leads to deterrence or to deeper destruction. Because what is certain tonight is that Israel's swift and relentless response has only begun, and the people caught in the middle will pay the heaviest price. The proxies are always there, waiting in the shadows, shaping the battlefield without ever stepping directly onto it. That is the reality of the Middle East, and it is the reality of this conflict. Hamas may be firing the rockets, but Hamas is not acting alone. Behind them, there are networks of money, weapons, intelligence, and political cover, all pointing back to the same regional powers that have long sought to weaken Israel through indirect means. Iran is the most obvious name on the list, the state that has armed, funded, and encouraged groups like Hamas and Hezbollah for decades. Tehran knows it cannot confront Israel directly in open warfare, not without catastrophic consequences, so it uses proxies, movements, and militias that can bleed Israel without exposing Iran's own cities to retaliation. That is the logic of the proxy war, and that is why tonight's escalation is not just about Tel Aviv or Gaza. It is about the larger strategy unfolding across the region. The attack on Tel Aviv may look like Hamas acting alone, but the fingerprints of its backers are hard to miss. The sophistication of the weapons, the timing of the strikes, the coordination involved, all of it points to the kind of support that Hamas could not sustain without outside help. And that is what makes this moment so dangerous. Because when proxies move, they are not just representing themselves, they are signaling for the powers that stand behind them. Every rocket fired into Israel carries with it a message, not just from Hamas, but from those who empower Hamas. And Israel knows this. That is why Israeli officials do not just talk about Hamas in isolation, they talk about the axis of resistance, the web of malicious movements, and governments that all share one goal, the weakening, if not the destruction, of the Israeli state. This is the hook that turns a local conflict into a regional one. When Hamas launches a total strike on Tel Aviv, Hezbollah is watching from the north, calculating its next move. Iran is watching from afar, gauging how far it can push without triggering direct confrontation. Other groups scattered across Syria, Iraq, and even Yemen are watching too, ready to declare solidarity, ready to join the fight if the signal comes. That is how proxy wars work. They are like dominoes waiting for the first one to fall. And tonight, many are wondering whether Hamas has already pushed that first domino. The presence of proxies also changes the way Israel responds. Israel is not just thinking about Gaza when it sends its jets into the sky. It is thinking about Hezbollah's tens of thousands of rockets in Lebanon. It is thinking about Iran's nuclear ambitions. It is thinking about a map filled with threats that could erupt if it shows even the slightest weakness. That is why the retaliation is so fierce, why the rhetoric is so uncompromising. Israel believes it is not just fighting Hamas, it is fighting the machinery of its enemies in the region. To show mercy in Gaza, in this view, is to invite Hezbollah to attack next, to invite Iran to escalate, to invite chaos on multiple fronts. And here lies the danger. Proxies are not easily controlled. Iran may fund Hamas, but it does not always control Hamas. Hezbollah may coordinate with Tehran, but it also pursues its own goals, its own timing. That unpredictability is the terrifying element. Because once the first rockets are fired, once the first airstrikes land, no one can guarantee how far the conflict will spiral. And when multiple proxies feel emboldened, when they see one of their own striking at Israel with force, the temptation to join in grows stronger. That is how regional wars ignite, not by careful planning, but by one proxy taking one step too far. The hook that captures global attention is not just the rockets hitting Tel Aviv or the airstrikes flattening Gaza. It is the specter of something larger lurking behind it all. It is the sense that this is no longer just Hamas versus Israel, but Israel versus a network of enemies who have been preparing for this moment for years. Every headline tonight about Tel Aviv carries with it a silent question. Is this the beginning of the wider war everyone has feared? Will Hezbollah step in? Will Iran push further? And if they do, will the United States, will Europe, will the rest of the world be pulled into a fire that has already burned for generations? That is why the role of proxies cannot be underestimated. They are the invisible hand behind the chaos, the accelerant poured onto every spark of violence. And as Tel Aviv reels from tonight's assault, the world is not just watching Hamas. The world is watching the shadows, waiting to see which proxy moves next, and whether this moment is the one that pulls the entire region into catastrophe. The pattern is tragically familiar, and yet every time it unfolds, it feels even more brutal than before. A rocket lands in Israel, Israel retaliates with overwhelming force in Gaza, and then Hamas responds again. It is a cycle that repeats with a deadly predictability, each side locked into a rhythm of violence that neither can seem to escape. What makes this cycle so devastating is not only its inevitability, but the way it escalates. Each new round is larger, deadlier, more destructive than the last. And each time, the question is asked, where does this end? And every time, the answer feels further and further out of reach. What Hamas did by launching a large-scale attack on Tel Aviv was not just provoke Israel, it was to set the cycle in motion again at a higher level than before. Hamas knew what Israel's response would be. They knew Gaza would be bombarded. They knew civilians would suffer. And yet they fired anyway because this cycle is part of the strategy. Hamas believes that the more Israel retaliates, the more anger and despair will spread in Gaza and beyond, creating new sympathy, new recruits, and new energy for their cause. In their eyes, suffering is not only a consequence, it is a tool. The hook here is chilling for Hamas. The devastation of Gaza is part of the plan, part of how they keep the conflict alive, part of how they ensure that Israel never has peace. For Israel, the calculation is no less cold. The doctrine is clear: every attack must be met with such force that it deters the next one. Retaliation is not just punishment, it is supposed to be prevention. But history has shown again and again that the prevention never lasts. The strikes come again, sometimes weeks later, sometimes months, sometimes years, but they always come. And so Israel's leaders escalate the retaliation each time, believing that greater force will bring a longer silence. But that silence is never permanent. It is only an intermission before the next act of violence begins. And it is the people who pay the price. In Tel Aviv, families run to shelters, children listen for the sound of sirens, the fear of rockets becomes a part of daily life. In Gaza, the suffering is magnified 1,000-fold. No shelters, no safe zones, no escape from the bombardment that turns neighborhoods to rubble. The cycle does not care about innocence. It does not distinguish between militants and children. It only demands new victims with each turn. That is the deepest tragedy of this conflict. It is self-perpetuating, and the people caught in the middle have no way to stop it. The hook that draws our attention every time is the immediacy of the horror. Rockets streaking across the night sky, buildings collapsing in Gaza, the sound of explosions echoing in cities that should be filled with life. These images are broadcast instantly, and they sear into our minds. They remind us not only of the violence of this moment, but of every moment like it that came before. They remind us of how long this cycle has continued and how deeply entrenched it is in the politics of the region. And yet, despite the devastation, both sides believe they are gaining something by keeping the cycle alive. Hamas believes it gains legitimacy and attention, showing that it can resist Israel and strike deep into its territory. Israel believes it gains deterrence, showing that no attack will go unanswered. But when you look closely, when you see the endless destruction, the shattered families, the broken cities, you are forced to ask, who really gains here? Who benefits from a conflict that never ends? A cycle that only multiplies the grief. This is the cruel reality. Both sides are locked in a pattern where stopping seems impossible. Neither wants to appear weak. Neither wants to give the other side a victory. So the strikes continue, the counterstrikes follow, and the civilians, always the civilians, are the ones who bear the cost. And as long as this cycle continues, as long as violence is met with violence, the world will keep watching the same story unfold, waiting for an ending that never comes, and asking the same haunting question every time: how much more suffering will be enough before someone dares to break the cycle? The possibility of this conflict spilling into a wider regional war is not speculation. It is the fear hanging over every discussion tonight. The attack on Tel Aviv and Israel's retaliation against Gaza are not isolated events. They are signals watched carefully by actors across the Middle East who are deciding whether to sit on the sidelines or step into the fire. This is the nightmare scenario that has haunted Israeli leaders, American diplomats, and regional governments for decades, that a clash between Israel and Hamas could serve as the spark that ignites a much broader war. And tonight, with proxies already stirring and rhetoric hardening across capitals, that fear feels closer than ever. When Hamas launched its strike on Tel Aviv, it was not just Israel that took notice. In Lebanon, Hezbollah watched closely, weighing its options. Hezbollah is far more heavily armed than Hamas, with an arsenal of precision, guided missiles that could devastate northern Israel if unleashed. The group has long promised to act if Israel weakens, and Hamas's assault may look like an invitation to escalate. Israel knows this, which is why its military is now on high alert not only in Gaza, but along the northern border. A two-front war would stretch Israel's defenses to their limit, testing even the Iron Dome and other missile defense systems that Israelis depend on for survival. The hook that keeps this story burning in the world's imagination is the domino effect. When one front opens, others may quickly follow. Iran, the power most closely tied to Hamas and Hezbollah, is watching for an opportunity. Its leaders know that drawing Israel into a multi-front conflict could weaken its military, strain its alliances, and reshape the balance of power in the region. Across Syria and Iraq, Iranian-backed militias are also poised to act, and in Yemen, The Houthis have already shown their willingness to strike targets far from their borders. This is not a war that stays confined to Tel Aviv and Gaza. It has the potential to stretch across the entire map of the Middle East. Israel understands this risk, but it also faces the pressure of its own politics. No Israeli leader can afford to appear hesitant after Tel Aviv has been hit so hard. The calls for decisive action, for crushing Hamas, for proving strength grow louder with every rocket. Yet the stronger Israel's retaliation, the greater the chance that Proxies will step forward in solidarity with Hamas. This is the paradox of deterrence in a region filled with actors waiting for their chance to strike. The harder Israel hits, the more it risks inviting escalation on multiple fronts. And then there is the role of the United States. American warships are already in the region, and Washington has vowed its support for Israel's security. But what happens if Hezbollah enters the conflict? What happens if Iran decides to test the limits of American commitment by pushing its proxies into the fight? A regional war does not remain regional for long when superpowers are involved. The United States, Russia, and other global players each have stakes in the Middle East, and a larger war could drag them all into direct confrontation. That is why every rocket fired tonight is more than a weapon. It is a warning. The people living through this are caught in a storm far bigger than themselves. For them, the talk of regional war is not a geopolitical debate. It is a looming terror that threatens to destroy not just their cities, but the entire fabric of daily life. In Tel Aviv, families fear that tonight's attacks are only the beginning of something larger. In Gaza, people wonder how much more they can endure as the bombardment intensifies. And across the Middle East, millions hold their breath, asking whether their homes will soon become the next battlefield. The hook that makes this moment so urgent is the sense that the world is standing at a tipping point. Every action taken tonight could push the region closer to the edge. Every strike, every retaliation, every threat carries the potential to unlock a war that no one can fully control once it begins. That is why this is not just another round of conflict between Hamas and Israel. It is a moment that could spiral into the regional war that has been feared for generations, a war with consequences that would reach far beyond Tel Aviv and Gaza, shaking the entire world. At the center of all this violence, beyond the politics, beyond the military strategies, lies the most devastating reality. It is always the human beings who pay the highest price. Politicians make statements, generals draw up battle plans, and commentators describe the moves on a map, but in Tel Aviv and Gaza, it is families, children, the elderly, and ordinary people who endure the unimaginable. The rockets that streak toward Tel Aviv do not stop to ask whether the people in their path are soldiers or school teachers. The airstrikes on Gaza do not distinguish between militants and toddlers. When the smoke clears, it is human lives left shattered, and it is human suffering that fills the void. The hook that grips us tonight is not just the explosions or the fiery rhetoric of leaders, it is the faces of those caught in between. In Tel Aviv, parents rush their children into shelters, hearts racing as sirens blare through the night. In Gaza, families crouch in the dark, listening to the sound of warplanes circling overhead, knowing they have no shelter, no defense, no safe place to go. It is these moments of terror that define the reality of this conflict far more than any official statement or political calculation ever could. The human cost is not only immediate, it is generational. A child who survives a rocket attack in Tel Aviv grows up with fear etched into memory, shaping how they see their neighbors and their world. A child who crawls out of rubble in Gaza grows up with grief and anger, carrying the scars of loss into adulthood. This is how the conflict perpetuates itself, not only through weapons, but through the lived trauma of ordinary people who inherit the pain of the wars they had no power to stop. When leaders talk about deterrence, when militants talk about resistance, what they rarely acknowledge is that it is these children who carry the burden long after the headlines have faded. And there is another dimension to this suffering, the invisibility of it. In Tel Aviv, the world sees videos of sirens, shelters, and interceptions in the sky. In Gaza, much of the suffering happens in silence, behind closed doors, in hospitals without enough supplies, in neighborhoods where entire families disappear beneath the rubble. The world sees pieces of the human cost, but never the full picture, and so the cycle continues detached from the scale of its destruction. That invisibility is itself a weapon, because when suffering is unseen, it is easier to ignore, easier to dismiss as collateral damage, easier to allow to happen again. The hook that should stop us cold is this: for every strike, every counterstrike, the political and military goals remain elusive, but the body count rises. Israel's deterrence is never permanent. Hamas's defiance is never crushed completely. But the cemeteries in Gaza grow, the shelters in Tel Aviv fill again, and the cycle of grief becomes the most reliable constant in the conflict. This imbalance between the lofty claims of strategy and the brutal reality of death is what makes the human cost so unbearable to watch. And still, the world debates policies, strategies, alliances, while civilians dig their children out of rubble and bury their loved ones. That is the cruelest part of all. The people who hold the least power in this conflict, the ones with no seat at any table, no say in any decision, are the ones who lose the most. They are the ones whose lives are reduced to statistics, whose grief is summed up in numbers, whose humanity is too often erased by the language of war. The story tonight is not just about rockets or retaliation, not just about Hamas or Israel. It is about the ordinary men and women who want only to live, who want their children to grow up in safety, who never chose this war but find themselves paying its price. That is the truth that cannot be ignored, the truth that must be repeated, the truth that lingers long after the bombs stop falling. Because if there is one constant in this conflict, one undeniable fact, it is this: when the politicians finish speaking, when the generals finish fighting, it is always the innocent who carry the heaviest burden, and their suffering is the part of the story that never ends. As we close tonight, let us not lose sight of what matters, not the politics of power, not the military strategies written in hidden rooms, but the human beings caught in this storm. Every explosion in Tel Aviv, every strike on Gaza, every move by a proxy force, it is always the innocent who pay the highest price. And so we ask with urgency, with grief, and with clarity: who will choose peace when destruction is this profitable? Who will step forward to stop this before it consumes not just Tel Aviv, not just Gaza, but an entire region already drowning in conflict?